No one asked the rancher's daughter in a wheelchair to dance, until a farmhand did nobody in the town of San Isidro, Jalisco, had ever asked Esperanza Vidal to dance. Not once in 26 years of fiestas and Saints' Day celebrations. Welcome. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which part of Mexico or which country you are watching from. The chair had been her companion since she was 9 years old, the year a horse spooked on the upper pasture and the fall left her legs without feeling. Her father, Don Aurelio Vidal, had wrapped her in her mother's rebozo, a worn honey-colored shawl with embroidered blue birds at each border, and carried her down from the hill himself, weeping the whole way. Her mother was already gone by then, taken by fever 2 winters before. The rebozo was all Esperanza had left of her. She kept it folded across her lap every day, the way some women keep rosaries in their hands. She was not bitter about the chair. That was what people never understood about her. She managed the ranch's accounts with a precision that left the hired men speechless. She kept her father's ledgers, negotiated the prices of the cattle sales, and knew every corner of the Vidal property. 200 hectares of rolling hills and milpa fields outside San Isidro, without having walked them in 17 years. What she could not manage, Don Aurelio had always managed alongside her. And what he could not manage, the ranch hands handled under her direction. It was a life of quiet usefulness, and she had made her peace with it. Then Don Aurelio died on a Tuesday morning in March, with the cold still clinging to the Sierra, and everything that had been quiet became very loud. The cousins arrived before the earth was cold on her father's grave. Rodrigo and his wife Consuelo, and Rodrigo's brother Enrique, with his 2 grown sons. 5 people who had not visited the rancho in 6 years, not once, not even when Don Aurelio had taken ill the previous autumn. They arrived in clean boots and with a notary from Guadalajara, and they sat in Don Aurelio's front sala and did not offer Esperanza a cup of water. The property reverts to the family line, Rodrigo announced without looking at her, spreading papers across her father's table. A daughter in your condition cannot run a ranch of this size. It is better for everyone if we manage the transition. His wife Consuelo added, not even lowering her voice, she can stay in the small room off the kitchen. There's a ramp there already. Esperanza did not cry. She held the rebozo against her chest, looked at the papers without touching them, and said nothing. The notary, a thin man with glasses, looked away toward the window. The afternoon sun fell across her father's chair, the one where he had always sat after supper, and she noticed it was already pushed to the side. She had 3 days. That was what Rodrigo said. 3 days to decide where she would go, because the ranch hands would be dismissed, and new management would take over the property. Rodrigo's eldest son walked through the sala that same evening, measuring the walls with his eyes, already planning something. Esperanza sat in her chair beside the window as the household that had been hers since birth moved around her like she had already become furniture. She thought of 2 places she could go. The first was an aunt in Zapopan, a woman she barely knew, who had responded to her letter with a single careful line. We will see what we can arrange, mija. The second was a property her father had mentioned once, years ago, in a voice so low she had almost missed it. A small parcel of land on the edge of the rancho. An old casita and a fenced-off corner of the lower pasture that her father had registered separately, under her name, the year after her accident. She had not thought of it in years. She did not know if it still stood. She did not know if she could get there alone. She left before dawn on the 2nd day, before Rodrigo was awake. A ranch hand named Old Timoteo, who had worked the property since before Esperanza was born, hitched the mule cart without being asked and drove her down the Terracera road without a word. the morning fog sitting in the barrancas below. The rebozo was around her shoulders. She carried a wooden box of her father's papers in her lap and a small photograph tucked inside. Her parents on the day of their wedding, standing together in front of the ranch gate. Her mother wearing the rebozo, laughing. In the photograph, her father was looking at her mother the way a man looks at something he cannot believe is real. The casita was smaller than she remembered from her father's description, and more broken. One side of the portal had collapsed. The door hung on a single hinge. Weeds had taken the front yard, and the old stone pillar in the corner was full of rainwater and leaves. But the roof was mostly solid, and the floors were swept. Timoteo had come ahead 2 weeks before, without telling her, because Don Aurelio had asked him to, quietly, before he died. Inside there was a cot, a small table, and an iron chair Don Aurelio had placed for when she visited, though she never had. On the table was a jar of Jamaica flowers, already dried but still a dark red. Timoteo unloaded her things without ceremony, set the wooden box on the table, and said, "The well is clean. I'll come Tuesdays and Fridays." Then he left, because there was nothing more that needed saying between them, and because she needed to be alone. She sat in the doorway that first evening and watched the last light leave the hills. The air smelled of wet earth and the distant smoke of some other kitchen. She pressed the rebozo against her face and breathed in what remained of her mother's scent. Whatever small ghost of it still lived in the old fibers. And then she folded it carefully across her knees and began to plan. She spent the first week learning the limits and distances of the casita, where the threshold dropped, which stone in the path tilted, how far her chair could reach before the ground turned to soft earth. She learned which hour the sun came through the south-facing window and set the floor warm, and she moved her chair to that square of light every morning with her father's ledger across her knees. Not because there was anything left to manage, but because it kept her hands busy and her mind from going where she did not want it to go. In the evenings she sat in the doorway with the rebozo across her lap and watched the light change on the hills, rose first, then copper. Then the deep gray blue that came just before dark, and she let herself feel, without rushing through it, the particular silence of a place that belongs to no one's grief but your own. What she did not yet know was that the casita shared a fence line with the western edge of the Vidal property, and that the man her cousins had hired to manage the boundary fence had already been working there for 2 weeks. His name was Camilo. He was 32 years old, a man from Durango who had come south after an accident of his own, not a fall, but a building collapse at a construction site in Guadalajara 2 years before that had taken 3 of the fingers on his left hand and left him with a limp that was worse in the cold and almost invisible in the warmth. He did not speak much. He rose before dawn and was on the fence line by the time the sun crested the hills, working with a methodical patience that the other ranch hands noticed but never commented on. He ate alone. He did not attend the Sunday dances in San Isidro, though he had been invited twice by the cook's daughters. On the 3rd morning after Esperanza arrived at the casita, he appeared at the fence line 20 meters from her portal. He was setting a new post in the rocky ground, and he was struggling with it, using his right hand and his wrist for what the missing fingers could not grip. He did not look up when he heard the wheels of her chair on the stone path. She watched him for a moment. "You'll split the post that way," she said. "Angle the mallet from the left side." He looked up. He looked at her chair. He looked back at the post. Then he angled the mallet from the left side, and the post seated cleanly on the second strike. "Thank you," he said. "My father built that fence in 1988, she said. "I know its problems." He said nothing more that morning. But the next day he came to the fence line again, and he brought 2 cups of café olla in a clay jar, and he left one on the stone wall near her portal, without ceremony or explanation, the way people in the campo pass things between them when they are too proud or too shy to call it kindness. She drank it. The day after that, she left a folded tortilla with cheese on the same stone, and when she looked at noon, it was gone. It was Timoteo who told her about the dance. The feast of San Isidro Labrador, the patron of the town, held every year on the 15th of May in the plaza. She had attended every year of her life as a child, before the accident, sitting on her father's shoulders so she could see above the crowd. After the accident, she had attended twice from the edge of the plaza, watching from a distance, before she stopped going. The paths were too rough for the chair, or that was what she told herself. The truth was more complicated, and she did not examine it. That evening, before she went to sleep, she would read something that had been waiting for her for 27 years. On the evening of the 14th, the day before the feast, Camilo appeared at her portal just as the sun was going down. He had cleaned himself up, a clean shirt, his boots brushed. He held his hat in his right hand. His left hand, with its missing fingers, was at his side. "If you want to go to the fiesta tomorrow," he said, "I know a path around the back of the market that's flat most of the way. There's one rough stretch, but we can manage it." He paused. "And if you want to dance, I can push the chair on the flat part of the plaza. They always sweep it before the fiesta." Esperanza looked at him for a long moment. She had not been asked anything like this in a very long time. Not since her father. "I don't dance," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "Not well. But I can push and turn a chair in a circle, and with the right music that's close enough." Something in her chest, which had been tight since the Tuesday morning in March when her father had not woken up, loosened a small amount, like a knot easing, but not releasing. "I'll think about it," she said. She did not sleep well that night. She lay on the cot, with the rebozo folded beside her, and the wooden box of her father's papers on the table, and she thought about the photograph inside it, her parents dancing, her mother's borrowed laughter, her father's disbelieving joy. She had carried that photograph across the Terracera Road and through the broken door of this casita, and she had not yet taken it out of the box. She was not sure she was ready. But at some point before the madrugada she rose and opened the box and set the photograph on the table, propped against the clay jar, and lay back down and looked at it in the dark, until the first birds started outside and she could smell the morning air coming through the door. That night, while Esperanza was sitting with her father's photograph, a letter was being written in the rancho's main sala. Rodrigo had contacted the notary again. He had found a problem, or believed he had found one. The property transfer documents were missing a signature. A secondary document that should have been filed alongside the original registry had not been found in any of the files his sons had searched. Rodrigo was not worried, exactly, but he wanted the matter resolved before the town's attention was on other things. He told the notary to come to the rancho in 3 days. He did not know that Timoteo had already seen the secondary document. He did not know that Esperanza's wooden box contained more than a photograph. The fiesta of San Isidro arrived with a sky so blue, it looked painted. Camilo came to the casita in the late afternoon, and Esperanza was already in her chair and waiting, the rebozo around her shoulders, her hair braided the way her mother had taught her. They went by the back path behind the market, and the rough stretch was rough but short, and neither of them said anything about it. When they came into the plaza, the music was already playing, a brass band from a neighboring town, loud and golden, and the children were running in circles, and the old women were sitting in their chairs along the wall, with their fans moving slow. Esperanza had not been in this plaza since she was 14 years old. She had forgotten how it smelled, carnitas and marigolds and tallow candles from the chapel, and how the light fell in the late afternoon between the arcade columns, striped and warm. She held the rebozo in her lap. They watched for a while. Then the band changed to a slower piece, something her father used to hum while he checked the ledgers, and Camilo stood behind her chair and said, quietly, "Ready? You'll step on the wheels," she said. "Probably," he said. But not on purpose. He pushed the chair in a slow circle on the swept stone of the plaza. He was not graceful. He stepped on his own feet once and nearly on the wheel twice, and he said "pardon" to the wheel the second time, as if it were a person, and she laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her, the kind that comes before you decide to let it. People nearby looked. Some of them smiled. Old Doa Herlinda, who had known Esperanza's mother and had never quite forgiven the town for the way it had looked away from Esperanza after the accident, said aloud to the woman next to her, "Posia era hora." It was about time. They made 3 circles. It was not dancing, exactly, but it was close enough, and the music filled the plaza, and the rebozo's embroidered birds caught the late afternoon light, and Esperanza held on to the shawl with both hands and let the evening be what it was. And then, on a Sunday morning 11 days later, Rodrigo and Enrique and the notary arrived at the casita. They had not expected Esperanza to have papers. They had assumed, because they had always assumed, that the property her father had registered in her name was a small formality, a sentimental gesture that could be dissolved with the right argument and the right pressure. They had not thought about what a man who loved his daughter with the particular fierceness of a man who knew his own time was running short might have done 17 years before, on a cold December morning in Guadalajara, sitting across from a notary in a 4th-floor office while the city moved below them and his daughter, back in San Isidro, was learning to manage a wheelchair and a grief she was too young to have. They had not thought about what such a man might put in a wooden box, in careful order, beneath a photograph. The document was folded 3 times, the paper aged to cream at the creases. Don Aurelio's handwriting was on the cover in ink that had darkened with the years. Para Esperanza. Para cuando llegue el momento. For Esperanza. For when the moment comes. Timoteo had found it the previous evening when Esperanza finally opened the box again, drawn back to it by some instinct she couldn't explain. On the same night, the cousins were writing their letter to the notary in Guadalajara. She had read it twice in the lamplight, very slowly, her hands completely steady, the rebozo across her lap, and the photograph of her parents witnessing from the table. Then she had folded it back along its original creases and placed it on top of everything else in the box, where it was now, ready. The document was notarized in Guadalajara in the winter of 1997, in which Don Aurelio Vidal, of sound mind, had established that the lower casita and its surrounding parcel of land, 42 hectares of pasture and 2 water-bearing springs, were transferred in full to Esperanza Vidal, irrevocably and not subject to revision by any other heir or relation, and the document had been witnessed by 3 parties, their signatures and the notary seal still clear. Timoteo stood in the yard. He had brought 2 other men from the property with him, quietly, that same morning, before anyone arrived. The notary looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at Rodrigo. Rodrigo's face had gone through several colors in the space of a minute. "The springs," Rodrigo said, his voice low. "Those are on the parcel." "Yes," Esperanza said. She was sitting in her chair in the shade of the portal. She held the document in her hands, steady. "My father registered them 17 years ago. The water rights are attached to this parcel. Without them, the upper pastures cannot be irrigated in summer." The notary said gently to Rodrigo, "This is properly executed. There is no dispute I can assist with here. You cannot manage this land," Rodrigo said. He was looking at her wheelchair. He said it the way a man says something when he knows the argument is already over, but cannot stop his own mouth. A woman alone, in your situation, Camilo, who had been standing near the fence line and had not moved or spoken, said one thing: "She manages it fine." He said it without raising his voice, the way you state something that is simply true. And then he went back to his work. Enrique touched his brother's arm. "Rodrigo," he said quietly. They left the same way they had come, in silence, the notary walking a half-step behind. Rodrigo did not look back. His sons said nothing. Timoteo watched them go, then turned back to Esperanza and gave a small nod, the kind that means everything is done and nothing more needs to be said. Esperanza sat in her chair for a long time after they left, with the document in her lap and the rebozo across her shoulders, and the morning sun moving slowly across the stone of the yard. She was not trembling. She had not trembled. But something in her chest that had been holding itself closed since the Tuesday morning in March was, finally, opening. Meses después. When the rains had passed and the pastures had turned the deep green of late summer, the casita was not a ruin anymore. The portal had a new roof beam, cut and set by Camilo on a Saturday in June. The pila had been cleaned and now ran clear. A small garden grew along the south wall, chiles and herbs, and a young naranjo her father had once mentioned planting, but never had. Old Timoteo came on Tuesdays and Fridays still, and sometimes stayed for supper, and sometimes his wife came with him, and the three of them sat in the portal while the light fell behind the hills and the tecolotes started calling from the oaks. The photograph of her parents stood on the table inside, propped against the clay jar which now held dried marigolds from the rancho's edge. The rebozo hung on a hook beside the door, where anyone entering could see the embroidered birds at the borders. Camilo had asked about it once, on an evening when the air was cool and they were sitting outside, and she had told him about her mother, and then about the dance, and then, carefully, as if she were checking each word before placing it, about the Tuesday morning in March, and the cousins, and the document in the box, and what her father must have been thinking when he registered those 42 hectares and their 2 springs under her name all those years ago. He knew, Camilo said, after a moment. Yes, she said. He knew. They were quiet after that, the way people are quiet when they have said the true thing and there is nothing that needs to be added. Sometimes the people of the days that nearly break us are the ones who teach us where our strength was already waiting. That is how it was for Esperanza Vidal, given a wheelchair, a rebozo, a wooden box, and 42 hectares with water in them, all of it love in a form she had not known how to name until someone asked her, without hesitation, if she wanted to turn in a slow circle on a swept stone plaza. Has anyone ever believed in you at exactly the moment you were beginning to doubt your own value? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this story reached your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Until the next story, a warm embrace from heart to heart. Camilo had said only 4 words the evening the cousins left, before turning quietly back to the fence. Esperanza thought of them in the early mornings, sitting in the portal with the rebozo across her lap and the hills still dark against the lighter sky. She manages it fine.